let me give you the scope of the project so you understand what I'm talking about. What you just saw, the last part were two griots singing the story of Gao, singing the story of the foundation of Gao, singing the story of why the mosque in Gao was built, singing the story of the conversion of the king to Islam and all of these things. And they were singing in Jinnakan. And they're singing the lyrics, and they're singing it in their traditional language, and they're talking about it. For Janae, there's two Janaes. There's the one Janae, which is the old Janae, and then there's the more recent one, which you can visit where the new mosque is. But their song is basically connecting the history of the two, because it goes back, it's a very long history that goes back to like 600, 700. And then they recount the tale of what he's doing. But they do it in this particular language. And I thought that it was very important to hear, even if one doesn't understand what they're saying, because we have translations of what they said. We have interpretations of the song, as I suggested to you. But to hear what they said in the language that they say it in. Because often we think that the barriers to understanding a history, and especially with Africa, is that nobody cared write it down. But people did care write it down. And the vocalization of it, however, carried another element to it. And the rules of doing this, and the rules of griots and passing the stories down, in themselves was a tradition that is very important to understand, right? Because you think about the history that we take, the history that we embrace about any person or anything, and it is often involved in these stories. And these stories invade our public and private spaces. And indeed, the stories about Mali, the stories about Songhai, the stories about Ghana, are all kind of grounded stories in these ways. And some of that hasn't trickled down to the rest of the world because of the mythologies we have about what those stories are. And even some of the dismissal of the possibility that an African would write the history of what is happening in West Africa in the 16th century, in the 17th century, and that they would recount this story, and how this recounting and listening and hearing it gives a certain picture. Now, of course, the picture is full of the mythology, right, of the time, because all these stories are. If you think of the stories and the recounts of the travelers who went to Africa during this period of time, they also had their mythology. They also came with their Christian interpretations and point of views about what was real and what was possible. And so listening to the stories of the griots and reading the text of Tariq al-Sudan, you get a storytelling which is grounded in the narratives, in the stories, in the mythologies, in the cosmologies, which operate in that space at this time, right? Because we often tell histories, but whenever we tell the history, we're really telling the history to answer questions we have now. And in recounting those stories that we have now, I was very interested in capturing that activity on the African continent, and to capture that activity as a group of people who were very proud of their history. I mean, there was no shame in the game of people knowing about Gao and its role and celebration in the history of the area. There was no shame in knowing and telling the story of Mansa Musa and what he meant, and having the people who already have this in their consciousness as they think of who they are, as they think of what Mali could become. So their reference point for Mali is grounded in a narrative about their own history. This mosque and the architectural style, and with the adobe, using the earth and building it with the wood in the area, it all takes on a flavor of itself and is very reflective of the people's involvement with their history. Because one of the things about building on sand is that it moves. And one of the things about building on sand when you're kind of constructing or you have an old structure is the structure continues to be built. It all is as if it has a life in itself. And indeed, when they do analysis of these structures, the structures are as tall underground as they are above ground. And part of this is because of the maintenance which is going on perpetually. And it is a community involvement and a community act is to preserve the architectural structure and form of these buildings. And it is amazing how long they have been there. And it is equally amazing how they appear the same way. So they continue to modify the structure in a way that preserves its architectural structure and form.